Okay, hey, wealth builders. Welcome to episode 33 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, where we discuss hard talk about the hardest form of money, how Bitcoin relates to the Bitcoin and crypto markets, the macro and the geopolitical environment. And today, America is on fire. And I don't mean literally. I mean, it's a very crazy situation. I was going to be talking about the different types of policies with Bitcoin and crypto and how it's going to be impacted by either the Trump administration or the Biden administration. And that is assuming that Trump finds a way of staying out of prison. We're going to talk about all of that today. There are so many updates. I was going to do a little section 2 on El Salvador, but I think I'm going to push that to next week. I have noticed that the information flow each and every week is so aggressive and so large that there's less and less time for the educational piece. So today I'm just going to be covering updates, and I think we're going to take the whole 1 hour. So sit back, relax. I'm going to make sure you are armed with all the information that happens this week. And the main topic is going to be when I cover Bitcoin and when I cover macro and when I cover geopolitics, I'm going to make sure I cover exactly what the impact will be in all those areas based upon the Trump and Biden. So let's jump straight in. Right. So let's start with the Bitcoin updates. Firstly, the first thing we need to understand is that both Trump and Biden right now are competing for the Bitcoin and crypto vote. There are 50 million Americans, according to different sources, that hold Bitcoin and crypto. Now, we can't know that for sure because many of you could hold it in self-custody and you don't disclose those, even though you're meant to. But, you know, obviously America doesn't believe in freedom of privacy and information. So you're meant to be disclosing those. There's new forms from the IRS every time you file your tax return. And if you hold them at an exchange, obviously those exchanges are required to give that data to the IRS. However, they are both competing right now for the crypto vote. Bitcoin has become big enough that harnessing the Bitcoin community is its own demographic in America on its own. And just as that was happening, and we're going to be going through the different types of things that were covered in trying to compete to get the crypto vote. But just as Trump was winning over the Bitcoin community, it started with RFK. RFK came to the Bitcoin Miami conference a couple of years back, or about a year ago. And he made this announcement that, hey, guess what? It was a pretty weak speech, actually. What he was saying really didn't look like he understood Bitcoin from a real Bitcoiner's perspective. And it was a well-crafted speech, but the cracks were there. You can tell a mile off. Nothing like Trump's speech. Trump's speech was written to perfection to get the Bitcoiner. Whether it was written for him or he understood that, we shall see. But the RFK kicked it all off at Bitcoin Miami conference and said, hey, guess what? You can contribute to my political campaign except in Bitcoin. What we would love to hear is that Bitcoin's legal tender, because then you can use it like you can in El Salvador, where it's treated as a currency, which is very different from a tax perspective. But we know that the US is at the end of a debt cycle, 130% debt to GDP, which means that it is broke and it needs as much tax as it can collect. And Bitcoin is a great source of tax now. It's moved into over $1 trillion market. That then led to Trump obviously realizing that he can get the Bitcoin and crypto vote. So he started to make some things which we'll cover today. And then Joe Biden obviously has to react to that. And we start to get a reaction, which is that Joe Biden shows how corrupt the US process is. Because regulators are meant to be independent of politics. And regulators moved at a pace that was clearly in reaction to what was happening in the need for the political campaign. So let's stop pretending that these regulations are about investor protections. It is clear to me, when you follow the money, that there is a lot of what is being called a democracy is being exposed for what it is. And we'll be going through all of those different trends as well. But what is the big news? I don't think I need to tell anyone, but Trump has become the first convicted felon from an ex-president. Now, we all know that Trump does lots of illegal things. We also know that Biden does lots of illegal things. It comes with the job. And we all know that most ex-presidents have done legal things as well. But Trump is the first that's actually been found guilty in what is being called the hush money case. If you speak to any two Americans, they'll give you a different interpretation of exactly what's happened. It's beyond the scope of me. I haven't been following the case. I've just been following the money. And obviously the hush money is what he's been convicted of. But what was interesting is this could be the first convicted felon to become the next president of the United States. I think personally, and again, this is no opinion, the US system being a Ponzi scheme created by the dollar that was occupied by the Federal Reserve in 1913, that is at the end of a debt cycle where US foreign policy has been the destruction, death, and illegality criminal acts by many countries. That doesn't change under Trump and it doesn't change under Biden, but it will change the journey. And I'm going to share with you how it's going to change the journey. Now, what was interesting is immediately, if you're following the money, right after the conviction, Trump came out and said it is corrupt, it is rigged. And that immediately led to, if you want to fight the system, then contribute to my campaign right now. And he raised $39 million in 10 hours after being convicted in New York. Will he go to prison? That is the big question. We will find out, allegedly, on the 11th of July. If he doesn't, I am almost certain at this stage that Trump will be the next president of the United States. And the fact that he has been convicted will be the reason, one of the reasons why that will actually happen. We've already seen it. If you follow the money, $39 million raised in 10 minutes as a result. Many people, because Trump has said this was rigged, this is a disgraceful trial, that really plays into many Americans' understanding of how the system works right now. So he will be sentenced on July the 11th. And the reality is that by following the money, because we are now all on social media and we get to speak to each other, and we don't need to get our news through Fox News or CNN or any of those propaganda outlets for American propaganda, the USA really just looks corrupt. Now, you can take that corruption and you can take it either side. You can say Trump is a corrupt politician, and I'm sure he is. And you can say Biden is corrupt. Biden has been rigging the system and contacted the FBI and used all of his presidential strings in order to make sure this conviction happened. And you know what? You're probably both right. But people will vote based upon the fact of where they think the corruption actually is. And Trump is the anti-establishment narrative, and the anti-establishment narrative will be pushed further as a result of this. But here's the reality. It's probably not going to change anything. Whether you're going to vote for Biden or whether you're going to vote for Trump, you probably as an American have already decided. The rest of us, we don't get a vote. However, what does happen will impact all of us, because the dollar is impacting whether a country has inflation or doesn't have inflation. And it impacts whether you get blown up or whether you don't get blown up. And it impacts whether you're going to be on the wrong side of US foreign policy. And that's all going to be determined not by democracy, but by the lobbies. The large lobbies are what control the politicians, follow the money. They get their power by being close to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is transitioning America from capitalism to socialism until eventually there is a central bank digital currency, which is communism on a blockchain. And that slow transition is inflicted by the powers that be, paying the different lobby groups that pay the Congress members that control the purse strings. The most influential are the big pharma lobby, the defense military contractors lobby, the banking lobby, the Israeli lobby, and those are the main ones that are actually dictating policy for America. And just follow the money to understand why the politicians do what they do. This is the exact type of thing that when people have this extreme popularism, extreme left, extreme right, what does that mean? It means the ones on the extreme right are the ones that are closest to the central bank, paying 0% interest, that have all the money in order to control, to push all the power, versus the extreme left, which are the people that feel shafted by the system because they did not get the assets. And those assets did not increase their wealth. And therefore, they are not close to the central bank. So they pay 30% interest on credit cards to supplement their income and payday loans when they can't get paid anymore. And that is the extreme left that feels shafted by the system. The further and further that goes, the further wealth inequality goes, the further to the extreme left or the extreme right you are, and your views get shaped. And this is the type of thing that causes revolutions, civil wars at their extreme, particularly when the debt is above 100%. And America will ride out the system until it gets to over 200% like Japan, and it becomes a full welfare state. Fortunately, because of the different forever wars that have been fought, we have now all been able to communicate with each other all around the world and expose the system for what it is. Just follow the Israel lobby, follow the Congress members, follow how they speak, follow the law changes, follow the money that then goes back to those countries that then gets recycled into the lobby contractors, and you can figure out everything that didn't quite make sense to you at that time. Right, so let's make sure we get back into the Bitcoin side. So right prior to the conviction, what is it that Trump came out and said in his campaign? He said the perfect the perfect speech that was crafted by somebody that really understood the Bitcoin community. What did he say? I will ensure that the future of crypto, he hasn't quite figured out the difference between Bitcoin and crypto. Remember, Trump followed the money. He launched NFTs. Those NFTs were on top of Ethereum. So he's more of a crypto guy at the moment. And prior to that, he was saying that Bitcoin is competition to the dollar. So he doesn't like Bitcoin. But obviously, Bitcoin is now monetarily important for the vote. And so therefore, he's saying crypto. Bitcoin will be made in the USA. What that means, of course, if you've watched any of my previous videos, it means that he wants the mining industry made in the USA, means the mining industry needs to stay in the USA. USA got a bunch of the hash power behind Bitcoin because the Texas energy industry, watch my previous videos on the US energy industry, was moving towards US independence after being dependent upon Saudi Arabia. That impacts oil prices. That impacts natural gas. Natural gas impacts electricity. Electricity inputs power into Bitcoin mining because it's backed by electricity. And there is also a buoyant startup community within the USA. Companies that I invested in, like Coinbase, Kraken, many others, Exodus that does self-custody Bitcoin wallets, Circle, many different ones are being made in the USA. And so they want to create an entrepreneurial environment because right now all of those companies are thinking about losing because they don't feel supported. What else did he say? He said, I will support the right to self-custody for the nations, 50 million crypto holders. So 50 million holders he wants your vote from. The right to self-custody is a constitutional property right that I covered in previous videos. Make sure you fight for that right. Trump is saying that he will uphold that right. The current Biden administration hasn't been saying that. In fact, he has been arresting people from Samurai Wallet and Tornado Wallet, Tornado Cash. And right now, the person that's been in prison for 11 years is Ross Ulbricht, who created a website that allowed people to be put together to make the world more peaceful by taking things like drugs off the American black markets, where you have things like different types of monetary flows that allow and support that industry. Don't get taxed, but it supports the lobby groups. And then he created a website that allowed people to transact with each other in a peer-to-peer fashion online. And now he's in prison. So Trump also said, I will free Ross. 11 years is enough. Ross Ulbricht was the creator of the website. Ross Ulbricht came out and said, I can't tell you how I feel. So he also said that in the past. Remember, Trump said that and didn't follow through. He also said he would open the 9/11 investigation again. He didn't follow through. We all know why. But so he is saying those things. Now, I think at this stage, Ross, if he doesn't get that, that would be an evil act that we can all hold Trump accountable to. But if Biden wants to counter that, he can. We'll go through that. What else did he say? He said that he will counter the Elizabeth Warren goons, which are the anti-Bitcoin and crypto people that have been doing all they can to destroy the industry in America, connecting it to all of the worst things in the world, because she is owned by the banking lobby, of course. But that is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, because since the birth of the Bitcoin ETF, banking said, if you can't beat them, join them. We'll forget about this whole blockchain, not Bitcoin thing that they tried to do in 2013, 2014, and we'll move over to making commissions and supporting the industry and removing some of those regulatory challenges that involves banks being involved in Bitcoin. There was regulations that said they have to include it in their assets and liabilities. They said we want to custody it. But as the price of Bitcoin goes up, it becomes something that would require smaller banks to have more assets in order to meet the Basel requirements. They want to reverse some of those different things. And that is the Elizabeth Warren goons that is doing everything they can to make sure US is not involved in that. Okay, so will he do any of that? Probably not. Do I trust him? No. But he is saying the right things, and we can now hold him accountable. But Biden can do one thing. Biden can counter it right now by trying to get hold of the crypto vote. And so what has happened since then? Well, we covered it in last week and various other episodes, but we had Lit 21, the Information Technology 21 Acts. Now, I dug a little bit deeper. It's not everything you think. So what is the Biden administration doing? Well, he's saying we'll put together regulations for crypto, all good, create some more clarity, companies can have that, but it's also doing things like putting it into the definition of similar things like accredited investors, which means that as non-accredited investors, you can invest 10% of your investable income in Bitcoin. What about the people that want to invest the other 90% of their savings? Well, that would be a radical change as well, but we get more clarity. At the same time, what did we see? We saw a CBDC ban bill. Be careful. What does CBDC ban bill mean? Well, right thing, CBDCs are evil, but at the same time, it means that a CBDC bill, where essentially a central bank digital currency launches a stablecoin, and what are stablecoins backed by? They're backed by government debt primarily, and so it has radical banking reform that takes out the bank in the middle, very disruptive to the banking lobby. The bank lobby don't want a CBDC. They'd much rather have Bitcoin that they can earn commission off through ETFs, but they certainly don't want a CBDC. However, a CBDC is the future model for the government, from the banking system, being able to take over and continue its ability to take over government debt, because stablecoins are backed by government debt, which means that America pays interest on all of its government debt, backed by the CBDC, creates full reserve banking, backed by the credit rating of the US government, but the banking lobby doesn't want that. And so you expect a lot of pushback on that. However, what does it mean? It means you could have an anti-CBDC bill, which could be replaced with a government digital currency, a GDC. A GDC actually is a deleveraging effect, because it means, just like Abraham Lincoln did during the Civil War, you can actually fund governments without paying interest on it. And so the government could just issue debt and back its currency without paying the Federal Reserve interest, which means that you can have a significantly different financial system. And so that was also combined with an end the Fed bill. That is interesting, but end the Fed, ban CBDCs, have crypto regulations, could transition to government digital currencies on a blockchain, which is the inevitable transition from capitalism to socialism to communism in the end, by taking out the central bank in the middle, which means that you take out all of that leverage, which is the inevitable consequence of 130% debt to GDP. And so obviously the first thing they want to focus on is stablecoin regulation bills. And so both the left and both the right are proposing these bills. Biden is deciding after it goes through Senate, and you will see where we end up. But it is painting the perfect picture for crypto people to believe that America is going to be on the right side, but it is actually going to look closer and closer to the system that China has right now. And they always say the bogey monster called China is the one that does all the wrong. They got the social credit score. They've got the central bank digital currency, but so does America. They just call it FICO, and they remove freedoms, and they call it, Patriot Acts. And then slowly, it looks the same, and then you integrate it in a government digital currency. It is inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed because the US dollar is a Ponzi scheme, as is the Great British Pound, as is the Chinese yuan, as is the renminbi, as is the yen, as is the euro. Okay. So that said, he did say he would free Ross. So here's my challenge to the Biden administration and the people that want to vote for him. Say, if you want my vote, free Ross right now. Don't wait for Trump. And he could simply do that. He could give the presidential pardon. And we could actually see whether this is an administration that believes in freedom or not. Biden could also put together all of these different crypto regulations, and he can make sure. Why do we know that? Because it turns out that when you want to do it, when the lobby is powerful enough, you can get it done really, really quickly. When the lobby owns all the different Congress members, you get all of the different pro-Israeli lobby stuff that has got through at record pace. Also, it turns out that the regulators don't care about consumer protections. It turns out that you can get the bills through and you can get things approved as long as there is the political desire to make it happen. How do we know that? We saw it last week with the Ethereum ETF. Within 1 week, America said we are transitioning from no chance to the right lobby groups and the right pressure saying it's happening. Larry Fink from BlackRock said it doesn't matter whether ETH is a security, we are going to have an ETH ETF. BlackRock and Larry Fink say they push their money to the correct lobbies, the lobby push their money to the correct Congress people then tell the regulators, and the regulators say, hey, that consumer protection thing, not really that important right now. It's great, we benefit from it. However, it exposes the system. And we all know how America works right now. And then they say through the IMF, we'll export that around the world and make other countries look bad. They use the CIA in order to fund all the acts that you think are being done by other countries. And we have exposure of how the whole system works. But if you've been watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, you knew that all along. That's why ever since 2011, when I published my talk at the first Bitcoin conference on this very same YouTube channel, if you're watching on YouTube, shout out to everybody that's been with me for all along. They managed to protect themselves through Bitcoin, exit the system, and they self-custodies. They managed the risk. They didn't end up trading in all the crypto stuff. And they are now free from the system, just like myself, where I'm able to do whatever I can in order to exercise my freedom of speech while it lasts. Okay, remember how regulations work. You do the crime. They charge the fine. The regulators argue over who should get the fine. They make sure it's worth less than the profit. And they make sure that they then use that in order to collect more data so that the IRS can then collect the tax or the relevant tax authority, and is meant to be independent from politics. But we are seeing right in front of our eyes that it is not. And never was that more apparent. When the ETH lobby or the banking lobby that wanted the ETF got it through, and now magically out of thin air, ETH is no longer deemed a security. It is deemed a commodity, which was the chief legal officer of Coinbase came out that was the effective thing, and is now if you look at some of the S1s and the filings, was it now been labeled? Because an Ethereum ETF, it has been labeled commodity-based trust shares. And so that settles that one. Now, speaking of that, BlackRock came out and they did their first updated S1 form for the Ethereum ETF. And so the spot Ethereum ETF is going through that process. Fidelity, the largest fund managers in the world, they come out and they started doing their rhetoric on the difference between Bitcoin and ETH. And everyone's now deciding how is it going to be pitched to institutional investors. Just to give you an idea, the BlackRock ETF is currently now bigger than Grayscale, which took years to build up its volume when there was regulatory capture to where it could only be available to accredited investors through an inferior product that didn't protect consumers. But now BlackRock's in. It is now the largest Bitcoin ETF in the world. They reported that Grayscale had about $19.6 billion of Bitcoin backing it. And there was a print that was just under $20 billion for the BlackRock ETF. All of this while finally, over a decade later, it was 2014 when the Mt. Gox bankruptcy started. A decade later, we saw movement of the Bitcoin from the Mt. Gox cold wallet that at the time when the bankruptcy started, it only had 10% of the money, the Bitcoin it owed its customers. But now that it's gone up in dollar value, it forced a 10-year hodl for all of those people, which was actually probably a great flavor. So many of them would have sold it, that they transferred from the Mt. Gox cold wallet $90 billion of Bitcoin, about 141,000 Bitcoin has now been transferred. And that is meant to be distributed on October the 31st, 2024. Happy Halloween. 10 years after the bankruptcy, those Mt. Gox creditors are finally going to actually get that. Now, there are a few more things I want to go through in terms of the corruption of the system. My favorite corrupt system is the bankruptcy system. Once you've been through one Chapter 11 in the US, you realize that the lawyer takes client money, steals your money. The people go into prison that stole client money without being involved in the bankruptcy system. And then the lawyers do the same. The lawyers steal client money up to $1 billion has probably been taken from FTX lawyers in the end of it. And then they engineer the system to be exactly how it benefits the people that are involved. Exactly what happened in Celsius, the bankruptcy that I was involved in. You get rugged by one criminal. You then get rugged by the people that are meant to represent creditors that end up representing themselves. You then get rugged by the lawyers that give all of the pro bono, pro quo, whatever it is, deals to all of their lawyers. And we got the FTX Examiner report. Now, of course, the victims pay for the Examiner report, and the Examiner comes out and says, I need $10 million to make this report. And then they say, and here's another 10 things you need to investigate. And guess what? Pay me from Victor's money. But at the end of it, we get an understanding of what actually happened. I'm going to go through some of the things that came out in the creditors report before we do the macro side and the geopolitical side, where I'll return back to the Trump and Biden conversation and how it impacts Bitcoin. For now, let's switch gears slightly to the US bankruptcy lobby, which is the lawyers that win in the end. So it was determined in the FTX bankruptcy that there is, guess what? No conflict of interest between the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, because it is okay that they represented both FTX before the bankruptcy in committing crimes of stealing client money and spending it, and they were also involved as bankruptcy lawyers. No conflict of interest there, says the Examiner report. What else do we know? Well, Sullivan and Cromwell, the lawyers that run the bankruptcy process, that also allowed FTX to commit crime, that has no conflict of interest, allowed $500 million of FTX client money and about, $50 million to purchase both shares in Robinhood. Full disclosure, I am a shareholder in Robinhood in the private equity before it went public through Bank to the Future, and to buy LedgerX shares and make that investment with client money. And yet they're allowed to paper over all of that stuff because they also represent the bankruptcy as well. But apparently there is no conflict of interest there. What else did we see? We found out that Sullivan and Cromwell communicated with FTX when they committed these crimes and found legal ways of doing it through deleted messages in Signal. So we don't have any of those messages, but they use self-deleting messages in Signal, according to the Examiner report. They also showed that member Sam Bankman-Fried, that is currently in prison for 25 years, he always said that FTX US wasn't insolvent. Turns out that FTX US was insolvent. it had a $48 million hole in terms of what it owed its clients. And at the peak, it had a $141 million hole, according to the Examiner report. It also showed that, do you remember what happened when FTX went bankrupt? We had that public statement from Binance. Binance was a shareholder in FTX. Follow the money. They received a bunch of FTT tokens when they became a shareholder, because a bunch of FTT tokens, which was money printed by FTX, that they propped up and manipulated to make it look like they were still solvent, just like Celsius did with the Cell token. Well, Binance basically dumped all of its tokens. If you remember, the announcement is going to publicly do that. They did that because it was all over Voyager. If you remember, they were both competing to try and get the acquisition of Voyager. Why did FTX need to acquire Voyager? Because it had all of this debt to Voyager that it wanted to hide in order to make sure it didn't show that it was insolvent. And so FTX had to win. What did they try to do? FTX buys and bribes politicians. Guess what? Those politicians, we don't need to bother looking at that criminal case. They said, we got enough on SBF and FTX to put him in prison for 25 years. So let's not bother looking at the political stuff. Let's not bother going into transparency there. So he buys off a bunch of using the FTX lobby in order to purchase politicians to write legislation in the way that FTX wants it to be done. And in order to paper it up, he needs to buy Voyager, which was another bankrupt company that was about to reveal many crimes because it went into bankruptcy prior to it because of FTX. Basically, they needed to win the bid. And so Binance said, and so what he did is he said, oh, Binance is illegal and Binance is a Chinese company. And therefore, any Chinese company is a threat to national security. And we're an American company, so you should come with us, paid off all the politicians. So therefore, in reaction to that, CZ came out saying, screw you. Why are you trying to win at the expense of Binance? I'm going to divest in FTT tokens. That crashed the price of FTT token, revealing the bankruptcy and revealing and putting SBF down. And so it was all a bunch of crony capitalism. But anyway, remember that it was Voyager that he was trying to win, because he had to paper up some of those crimes. Now, remember, customer funds were used in order to pay the shares in Binance, because Binance said you've got to buy back our shares, and it was customer funds that were used. That was approximately $2 billion. A bunch of it was fake money, FTT tokens. But we have not heard anything from that. Obviously, the US justice system said, well, we'll take $4.7 billion from Binance, and we'll put you up in prison for 4 months. But as long as you pay the $4.7 billion, we'll take the check. We're all good. And maybe you won't get any clawbacks. So Binance has not suffered any clawbacks, which is the process of when client money is used illegally, you're meant to be able to claw back that money. We haven't seen any of that yet. And so what do? They say, well, if the price of Bitcoin goes up, we can lock in the dollar value, tell creditors that they're 100% whole, and once they're 100% whole, pay them off, even though they lost a bunch of their Bitcoin, and those assets can come back to the next creditors in line, and we can get rid of this. Now, this is the definition of hush money, and this hush money is being used by US politicians, and yet Trump is going for prison for that. Now, I'm not saying he shouldn't. I don't care. I'm just saying that this is how the system works. So what is the corruption? The corruption is it only gets on the wrong side of that if you are on the wrong side of the politicians and the lobby groups. Follow the money and everything will make sense. But what else did we learn? There is somebody that got off that was covered in the Remember Sam Trabucco? Sam Trabucco mysteriously wasn't involved in the FTX case at all. Yet, 90 days prior to the bankruptcy, Sam Trabucco spent $50 million of client money. And the only reason people aren't coming after that right now is because they could pretend using the bankruptcy code that creditors are being made whole, because a bunch of them hold dollars and they don't care if they get their dollars back. It's just the crypto people. And of course, they auction off the crypto for pennies on the dollars. Mike Novogratz makes $1 billion. Pantera Capital make $1 billion by buying creditors' assets at discount. And of course, John Ray, who's in charge of the whole process, he gets to give himself a contract for the next 5 years and pay himself with client money as long as he can get vote on the plan. And of course, everyone votes for the plan because you want your money back. Why? Because Bitcoin's going up. You want your dollars back as soon as possible. And the FTX plan is due to be approved around about the time October of this year, 2024, when the Mt. Gox coins come through. But remember Sam Trabucco. Sam Trabucco was an executive at FTX, took out 50 million. And guess what he did with it? He bought a boat. And what did he use for that boat? Well, there are all sorts of stories. I won't go into it, but let's just know what the name of the boat was called in order for you to start to think what some of that boat money was for. The name of the boat is Soak My Deck. And he bought a bunch of real estate as well with FTX client money. They may come back after him, or they may not. Why? Maybe he knows something about the politicians that don't want to be implicated and the lobby groups that were involved in accepting the bribes of client money from FTX. But lots of employees got money out of FTX. Will they be clawed back? Well, if you're being made 100% whole, they haven't talked about clawbacks. And so they withdrew the money, got to stole the upside of those client Bitcoin. And the Examiner report shows that many, many people were involved. What about Daniel Friedman? Daniel Friedman facilitated billions of dollars of bribes to all of the whistleblowers, millions of dollars. About $25 million of bribes were paid to the employees that knew FTX was bankrupt, and apparently that's all good. That's legal. But the Examiner report said that should be looked into that. In fact, there was a $50 million settlement to a whistleblower. What was his name? Brett Harrison, the CEO of FTX US. Just making sure I get that. And that was in September 2022. He also claimed that he did not know anything about it, and yet he was paid $50 million. He came out and gave his defense story. But remember, their cover-up was that the FTT token, which they marked to market, even though it could only be sold for approximately 1% of the value, they were all using it for collateralized loans in order to take out client money, just like Mizhinsky's favorite method. The Mizhinsky method was to take the sell token, borrow against it, take out client Bitcoin and dollars, and hold it up as collateral. So Trabucco, he was defending the FTT token. It all comes out right now. He needed to keep it up, but he knew really early on that if you take out the value of FTT token, then they are significantly insolvent, and that insolvency is client money, which is fraud, my friends. But of course, he gets to take out his boat, and the Examiner reveals all. He knew about this, by the way, in 2019. Without FTT, just like with Celsius, which was a Ponzi scheme from day one that victimized 650,000 people, and the FBI started investigating it early, but still allowed a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme to emerge. And the co-founder, of course, is now working with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel on his AI startup after his wife, who's now propaganda for the IDF, was VP of loans that allowed this to happen at Celsius. And obviously, he's not in prison because he has the right to return using Israeli law to allow himself to get past the crimes, while Mizhinsky faces in January 2025 up to 115 years in prison for the same crimes. Okay. What else did we see? We saw that there are a bunch of exchanges like Gate.io, like KuCoin, like Huobi. Remember, Justin's son purchased Huobi. I went to the Huobi office in China a long, long time ago when it was different management. But they have held $130 million of client money, and they're just not responding to the bankruptcy anymore. Is that to fill a hole? Well, we all know that there is some dodgy transactions between Poloniex when Justin Sun bought it and Huobi when Justin Sun bought it. And it was done through the Tron blockchain, which is also being investigated. And Circle obviously said we're no longer using the Tron blockchain for the USDC stablecoin. Still a whole load to unravel there. Follow the money. But they've stopped cooperating with the debtors, and now they're 100% whole. John Ray will obviously use that money to give himself a cushy salary with all the lawyers that the Chapter 11 process allows for. There was $160 million of bribes that were paid to the Chinese government that took over $1 billion of bank seizures. And that was implemented with the support of the lawyers. And also done by, there was also another investigation into, what's his name? Ryan Salami. Is it Salami or Solani? Sorry if I got that name wrong. He has now been sentenced for 7.5 years. He pleaded guilty. The ones like Sam Trabucco, for some reason, they're just on their boat right now, even though he knew about it in 2019. What is the story? We shall see. But he pleaded guilty to unlawful political donations, exposing the US system, how US politics works, hiding the fact that it was paid, just like the lobby groups do. And he was also pleaded guilty to defrauding federal elections, the Federal Election Commission. US politics, showing how it works. What else was it? Conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money transmitter business. And he comes out and starts tweeting, saying the only reason, if I hadn't have borrowed against it, if I hadn't have listened to my lawyers, then I wouldn't be in prison right now. So he is saying, you don't go to prison for political corruption, but you do go to prison for that side. We shall learn more. What else? We got a few more cases before we get into the macro and geopolitical side. But Transform Labs, remember the USDC fake central banker pretending to be decentralized stablecoin, and Do Kwon, they have now settled with the SEC, and he will be facing his extradition to the US and South Korea to face those charges. But now there was a settlement with the SEC. We don't have the details yet. On the ETF side, we got the first UK Bitcoin ETPs, an exchange traded product. They are now live and trading on the London Stock Exchange. It will take financial institutions a long time to get through their compliance team, but hopefully you will be able to put those in your retirement funds, your SIPs and your pensions in the UK as you progress, because you can't necessarily put Bitcoin in them unless you're using more of a high net worth investor using one of the products on Bank to the Future, of course. Now, we also had progress with the old MicroStrategy strategy being used by other public traded companies. We had a healthcare company that is publicly traded. What's it called? I never heard of it before, but Semler Scientific. They have bought 581 Bitcoin worth $14 million. The share price on this news went up 30% because they're going to be using the Bitcoin, using Bitcoin as part of their treasury and their primary treasury, and doing a MicroStrategy reserve asset, which led to the recovery of MicroStrategy using Bitcoin as hard money and taking advantage of some of those properties. Then we had one more piece of news on the Bitcoin side. We had an announcement from Gemini Earn, the company run by the Winklevoss twins that got on the wrong side of Barry Silbert's fraud, which got on the wrong side of Do Kwon's fraud, which got on the wrong side of Three Arrows Capital's fraud. But they managed to use the fact that their Earn product was collateralized by the GBTC Bitcoin Trust, and therefore managed to get in front of the queue for their customers and received $2.18 billion worth of Bitcoin back paid in kind for their customers. Now, this goes in front of the queue of the other creditors in the Gemini case. The Genesis case. I always get confused between these two. Gemini, think twins, Winklevoss twins. Genesis, think Digital Currency Group, Barry Silbert, and there are other companies called Genesis as well, not to be confused with those. All right, so Winklevoss twins, Gemini, they managed to get all the Bitcoin back in kind, putting them as the one company that beat the fraud of the US Chapter 11 bankruptcy process, because the Winklevoss twins decided to pay the legal fees themselves rather than lawyers being involved in the process where they Dick Cheney the process for themselves. And so they showed that it can be done. Now, obviously, it was a different case. There was no token involved. There was no fraudulent Ponzi schemes being created by the Majinsky method and the SBF method and the Silbert method. However, they managed to get it back in kind because they were looking out for their customers and not themselves. So kudos to the Winklevoss twins. We shall remember in 2013, you tried to create the Bitcoin ETF. You were OGs in the industry and you did right by your customers after trying to stay on the right side of regulations. That shall be remembered. Gemini. I am not a shareholder in Gemini. It's the one exchange I didn't become a shareholder in. However, they have done right, and we will remember that. What do those distributions represent? Well, they made an announcement. This is essentially 97% of all the Bitcoin that was owed. It is 1 billion more than when Genesis actually halted withdrawals because the price has gone up. And so they get a 232% recovery from the Genesis bankruptcy since they halted withdrawals, because they're paying it back in kind and gave everyone their Bitcoin upside. They covered all the legal fees and they contributed 50 million of their own money. They did what was right by customers, and they got that because they made a good deal. They collateralized it by GBTC. Well done, Winklevoss. So we now know that of all the corrupt Chapter 11 processes, if you are in it for the customer, you do a lot better. If you weren't involved in a fraudulent founder like the Majinsky method and the SBF method, you do a lot better because they managed to pull out a bunch of client money and the lawyers managed to take a bit of it. But the best performing bankruptcies since the 2022 bankruptcy cascading effect as a result of USDT, 3 Arrows Capital, and all of the Ponzi schemes from before, from tokens. Number 1 is Gemini. Number 2 is FTX. Number 3 is Celsius, but only if the shares perform. There's going to be a new public company because he used $1 billion loan collateralized by client Bitcoin to buy a bunch of mining equipment. And that mining equipment is trying to be mined right now. And if the price of Bitcoin mining goes up together, then we will find out. That's another one. After that, it was Voyager. And the worst performing was BlockFi, because BlockFi decided to sell all of the Bitcoin at the bottom of the market and put it in Silicon Valley Bank and pay a fiat distribution. So that we do know now, and we will give further updates. Right. How are we doing for time? We are, what time did we start? Wow, we're about 1 hour in, and I've just covered the Bitcoin side. I'm going to now cover the geopolitical side. I think we've got another half hour to go just on the updates. So let's go through the macro side, then the geopolitical side. Right. Let's get back to the Trump and Biden conversation. So we all know, if you've watched any of my content, that stablecoin and Bitcoin policies will impact bank stability. Why? Because stablecoins are full reserve banking. Full reserve banking is the model that central banks want to use in constructing their central bank digital currencies. Full reserve banking is the biggest threat to fractional reserve banking, because you don't need the FDIC, which is another Ponzi scheme where it says we guarantee all of the deposits, yet they only have 1%. And so therefore it's backed by the Federal Reserve through quantitative easing. And that's backed by the credit rating of the US government, where the Federal Reserve benefits from that. And everyday people pay through inflation, as we've always covered. But both Trump and Biden, their reaction, what will it mean? So obviously, stablecoin regulations are important. Bitcoin policy is important. Now, I should caveat that Bitcoin doesn't care whether it's Biden or Trump. Bitcoin will succeed either way. Not financial advice, but I've been saying that for 13 years, and I don't expect things to change because it's just getting stronger and stronger and stronger. But the journey of Bitcoin will be impacted by short-term geopolitical events. So Biden and Trump, their policies and their relationships with Russia, Middle East, and China will impact things. So let's look at the two ones that impact oil. So the policies that they implement in Russia and Middle East, which is the one that impact oil impacts the OPEC, which is Saudi Arabia and the others. Their relationship with the president will impact whether they continue and engage in price fixing, which they will do because they'll either pick the US or Russia in constructing those. So obviously Russia is an important member of OPEC as well in terms of its oil production. And oil prices determine inflation at the same time as money printing. Remember, US has depleted its reserves. It got energy independent. But because of subsidizing oil, because everyone was queuing outside with gas prices before, that means that their reserves are lower, but they are independent at the moment. That controls inflation, and inflation controls rates. Rates control rich-poor divide. Rich-poor divide controls wealth inequality. Wealth inequality determines whether you feel you are on the left or the right because you vote in your own self-interest. And if it gets too extreme, as I've always covered, that determines when you have a civil war or a revolution, which then determines whether an external party takes advantage of that in order to execute a change of empire, and how aggressive they get in trying to destabilize the world reserve currency through de-dollarization and change the world order. And hopefully we don't blow all each other up at the same time. But there are massive escalations in all of those, and the relationships between the president of the world reserve currency matters. Now, with the exception of, what have we got here? With the exception of both Biden and Trump, they are basically likely to receive the same outcome long term. But the war side will determine whether we have a faster change of empire or a slower change of empire. So what is the situation right now? Well, the US must sell more bonds to keep its Ponzi scheme alive. So remember how the Ponzi scheme works. You have to dictate the flow of bank lending because the US dollar is a Ponzi scheme where there's more debt than money. And the only way to keep the economy alive is to have more debt. That more debt then gets pumped into those that have assets, stock market and real estate, at the expense of those that don't have those assets. And so the US doesn't care about its homeless people or its middle class. It only cares about policies that keep the stock markets up, keep real estate markets up, and they can only do that if they can sell more bonds. The day that people say we're not buying US bonds is the day the whole Ponzi scheme goes. So they have to sell more bonds in order to survive. Now, with de-dollarization, less and less foreign companies want to hold dollars as their world reserve asset. Why? Because it's sanctioning everybody. When it's sanctioning, it doesn't inspire confidence in buying those bonds. So the only way to get more people to buy those bonds is for yields to increase. The government has to pay more. Now, the government has to pay more because it's spending more on war, which goes back into the military industrial complex. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. However, you need to keep that going. And so bond yields rising allows the government to borrow more. And who's going to be the people that incentivize them to invest in those bonds? Well, it's going to be the American people. And the American people are going to do it because you probably get a stable coin or a central bank digital currency that just cuts the bank out of the middle and allows them to borrow more. Now, both of them, will operate the Ponzi scheme. That's the same. But this then drives probably initially which asset are they going to sacrifice in order to have stable coins and have the government borrow more? Well, it's likely to be the stock market. So this may be where the stock market gets its correction. So stop allowing companies through corporate bonds to borrow money from the central bank. And so change your quantitative tightening, quantitative easing policy so that it's not engaging in the corporate bond market. And then you can allow the stock market to be the one that goes first. And so you could expect that to come through when you follow the money in its instant. But that will eventually lead to selling pressure on stock markets and drive more. Now, there's an interesting thing that could happen as well. Imagine this. You've got within your retirement fund, you log into your Fidelity account if you're outside and you've got a bunch of US stocks. And this type of thing happens where US stock market is going through a correction. But in your stock market, you can convert it to a Bitcoin ETF. A Bitcoin ETF is backed by Bitcoin, and that creates selling pressure in Bitcoin. Could this type of effect lead to a correlation between stocks and Bitcoin, or could it lead to an exodus from stocks into the Bitcoin ETF? Interesting one to watch. And so the policy of stablecoin regulations, which is what's going to determine when this happens, will certainly have an impact. And currently those are being written under the Biden administration. Whether that happens under Biden or Trump will be important next time. Right. We are at the 1 hour mark. I've got the geopolitical side to come through. I've got the finishing off of the macro side. I'm going to take a quick water break. Do me a favor. While I'm taking my water, after 3, hit the like button, retweet, subscribe, hit the bell symbol, or do whatever we can to get more and more people to be able to protect themselves and understand these trends. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we know that US taxpayers and householders is going to be the buyers of stablecoin. And that goes into the whole argument between the transition of banking between full reserve and fractional reserve, which leads into my prophecy of a central bank digital currency. And if there is a CBDC ban, then you may end up with a government-backed digital currency, or a government GDC, let's call it. Okay. The end result, of course, is always it makes government much larger. And the Federal Reserve is a mechanism for making the government much larger. Now, of course, we also said that China has now dumped, in the last 7 months, $75 billion worth of US treasuries. So they're racing to go down because they don't like what happened to China. Russia is also sanctioning all of the different countries as well. So obviously you've got China selling, and we started to see some of the Russia sanctioning of banks that are engaging in any type of process connected to US policy. And so we've started to see that as well. And obviously, BRICS continues going through the whole de-dollarization process. And so on the macro side, we started to see more and more countries joining BRICS, which is the corridor to trade without dollars initially. Then it leads to a BRICS investment bank. Then it launches its own digital currency through different rails. The latest countries to announce their membership, we've got over 45 now, but Thailand has said that it is now applied to join BRICS. And India, the most populous country in the world, and China, the second most populous country in the world, has decided that they will now ditch the dollar for all imports between the countries. What else has we said? We got an announcement from BRICS that is looking to boost trade with the European Union, which obviously is aligned with the US dollar. But European Union is now saying that it's going to be boosting trade with BRICS. We had an announcement there. And we had that, what else did we see? Yeah. So we've already talked about how the US is going to get to its 200%. So that is what's happening on the macro side. Now, we've got a bunch of escalations that are happening in the geopolitical side. Now, why is that important? So Trump is famous for being an anti-war politician. He believes that business is good, but obviously he did things that are also destabilizing in the Middle East. I've talked about that in previous broadcasts. It's beyond the scope of this broadcast. But war will 100% impact Bitcoin. Now, what tends to happen with war, we saw this with the Russian escalation with Ukraine, is that initially you get an in-line with risk-off assets reaction. Then they realize that Bitcoin is actually a solution to that, because when you don't want risk of fiat currency, you want Bitcoin, and it pushed to new all-time highs, or it pushed the bull market anyway. So these escalations, so if I were voting, and by the way, I don't get a vote, even though everything will impact me, but American people get to decide the vote. But if I were, I'd be voting based upon Bitcoin and war policy. But of course, the China-Taiwan policy will definitely impact Bitcoin. Why? We went through that last week. I really suggest you catch up on that one. But it's obviously semiconductors, which is the most important man-made resource, let's call it, in the world right now, because it backs up AI and it also backs up Bitcoin mining. Now, we'll do the game theory. We did the game theory of how it would react to that. But obviously, Bitcoin has that mechanism for adjusting if there's any type of reaction in the mining market. And I went through some of that last time. However, the China relationship with Russia and Iran is what's making up the BRIC side, and the BRIC side is what's making up more membership, which is what's making up de-dollarization. And we know that both Trump and Biden are completely escalatory with China. They've continued each other's policy, but they have a slightly different policy. So they both escalated with Iran and China. Trump did some of the biggest escalatory sides with Iran, we've covered in previous videos, and China, but they take a different stance on Russia, I would say. I would say Biden has been escalatory to Iran, destabilization, Russia, and China. So you get all three under Biden. If we get another Biden administration, I agree with Trump that would be incredibly escalatory. Trump has only been escalatory towards Iran through Abraham Accords and China through making it the communistic rhetoric of the boogie monster because of the IP war and the things I covered last week. However, Trump does have a relationship with Russia and a good working relationship. And we're starting to see that in some of the geopolitical announcements. And so for that reason, if you're looking at the Bitcoin vote, I think Trump's ahead right now, whether he does it or not. And if you're looking at the relationship with Russia in terms of de-escalatory, I think Trump wins that vote right now. And obviously, there's only one administration that allowed under their watch to paper up a genocide, and that is Biden right now. And so therefore, on those things, there's only one real vote. But will the process allow for it? It depends. He is more popular, I believe, so I think that will happen. But will they keep him out of prison? And that's really what we're going to find out on the 11th of July. And if he does, and that gets interfered with, I fear for America, because I think that we have hitched that 130% debt to GDP, which has driven extreme left and extreme right, which has brought us to where we are today. So let's look at some of the geopolitical announcement. I'm just going to go through a bunch of them because each one of those escalated in a big way this week. We already covered a little bit on China, but let me just race through some of the announcements before we close off this week. Now you understand why there was no time to cover El Salvador, because so much happened next week. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of calmer one next week. But let's just jump through some of the different things. So Israel escalated by essentially invading the West Bank, killing more people, and killing way more civilians within Gaza. That then led to a targeting of camps for displaced Palestinians. So displaced Palestinians were said, here's the safe zone, and Israel decided to target those. That led to additional rockets being fired from Gaza, and they went straight into Tel Aviv this time. So for some reason, the Iron Dome allowed those through. Now, whether that was because there was no injuries on that side, whether that was because they wanted them to get through to justify what happens next, or whether the Iron Dome is weakening, then I will allow you to decide. But it went straight into Tel Aviv. As a result, there was a reaction in Rafah, which is where all of the refugees are currently right now. And that led to the Israelis actually burning alive civilians in Rafah. And one of those, there was extreme, disgusting footage of a baby that literally left its head. Now, we remember on the 7th of October that we were told that there were 40 beheaded babies and they were burned alive. All of that was disproven to justify what they did next because those lies were coming through. Now we've actually seen it on the other side. And we have had a massive escalation in the killing. And that has made a massive geopolitically motivated reaction everywhere. At the same time, Rafah shares a border with Egypt, and there was the killing of an Egyptian soldier, which has created a bit of more escalation with Egypt that led to the shooting of an Egyptian by the Israeli Defense Forces. And that also escalates on that side. We also saw, as a result of this, as the burning alive of civilians, the European Union, they came out and they are considering sanctions on Israel. And why? Because the ICJ, the International Criminal Justice Court, came out and said, because of this, you must immediately halt your invasions of Rafah. Instead, they reacted by burning civilians alive. The European Union said you must halt your military. And so now they are in defiance of those orders. Turkey, who remember is a member of NATO, their president Erdogan, what did Erdogan say? He was saying that if you want peace, you have to be ready for war. He also said he was calling for an the Islamic world to unite against Israel. So more like an Arab League that came up, prior to some of the what's it called? The different I've forgotten the word now. Forgetting it. Okay. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. We're getting towards the end. So he also said that his country will do everything possible to hold Israel's barbaric prime minister, President Netanyahu, accountable for going to prison. There was an order to escalate his arrest, and only America wanted to defend that to get in the way of the political process. That led to a reaction from Saudi Arabia, who came out and said that they strongly condemn the genocidal massacres of Israel. So these are, leaders that are saying these things of the Palestinian people. Brazil came out and they officially said that the ambassador, they basically recalled their ambassador from Israel and said, we're not having ambassadorial relations with Israel. A US Senator, Elizabeth Warren, she tried to condemn people, but it was so funny. Community notes under X, they put, but then you voted for this and you voted to pay for that. So literally you pay for that when they were pretending to care about the massacre that happened. US Ambassador, of course, Nikki Haley, which was in the Trump race. She decided that this was a time to go to Israel. Why? Because she's received over $1 million from the Israeli lobby. And all of a sudden, she goes out to Israel and decides to sign the head of a rocket bomb that is going to be used to fire at children in this massacre. And she decided to write on the bomb, finish them, and engage in propaganda because she's got $1 million of campaign financing as commanded to do. The French president, he came out and he said he is completely ready to recognize a Palestinian state. So remember, over 150 countries recognize Palestine, but only the US veto votes every time as a result of the Israeli lobby. Spain came out, Ireland came out, and they officially decided to recognize Palestinian as an independent state with East Jerusalem as the capital for Palestine. Obviously, Israel and US are the only countries that don't want that at the moment, and because of that. Mexico came out. They decided that they're going to join Gaza. They're going to join South Africa in the Gaza genocide case against Israel. So they believe that in the International Court of Justice that this is a genocide. Spain also came out. What did they say? The defense minister said that Israel's war with Palestine is a real genocide. So this is coming from leadership at the top of countries right now. What else did we have? From within Israel, the opposition to Netanyahu, he decides that he's going to start launching. There's going to be a discussion to overthrow the Netanyahu government. So it's happening from within. but it's more systemic than that. It's definitely can't say it's just Netanyahu. It's definitely systemic into the business model of the country that requires population growth, illegal settlement expansion, and ethnic cleansing in order to achieve its goals of getting all the Jewish state over based upon the Zionist vision. Canada came out. They said that they are absolutely horrified by Israel's attack on Rafah. It does not support Israel's military operation. We even had Piers Morgan, who now finally says that enough is enough. Netanyahu, stop killing, stop fighting in Gaza. Colombia's president, they also came out. They said that they are going to call for the United Nations. What did they say? They want to start a peacekeeping process in Gaza, and says Colombia will be a part of these processes. And there was escalation with Yemen's Houthis as well. They actually downed some US drones, which wasn't really reported. Expect additional escalation with US and UK. And of course, China came out and they called for Israel to stop all of its military operations in Rafah. The president, Xi Jinping, he was calling for a Middle East peace conference to resolve the conflict between Israel and Palestine, which involves normalizing between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which involves a retreat of U.S. defense foreign policy, which involves stabilization of the Middle East, which involves U.S. foreign policy retreating, which involves Israel not getting what they want, which involves the defense lobby getting less money by selling less weapons, but China gets to say it could normalize that. Now, then obviously, China decided that it would start its escalation with Taiwan, and the United States has no finger pointing on the Taiwan question. There was all statements there. What did they announce? They announced that nothing will defer China from defending their sovereignty and their territorial integrity and the one China policy. China decided that it was going to warn the United States that anything with Taiwan and it will adhere to the one China policy. They are ready to defend that. And US has said they're already sending funds over to Taiwan from the last bill. The Taiwan president, he reacted because of the escalation where we covered last week, that he is ready to work with China on diplomatic ties. We shall see how that progresses. But the Times reported that China is preparing a large military feat for what they called an invasion as well. And then we're at the few things. The Saudi Crown Prince, Triple M, he decided that he wants to now explore normalization with Iran as a result of China's meeting and to strengthen their relations. This is the first time that the Iran president has decided, or leader, has decided that he's going to visit over in Iran, and that's the first time for 2 decades. So that relationship is strengthening, which is an anti-Abraham Accords, which has destabilized the Middle East through taking out Iran. And Iran then said it wants to establish diplomatic relations with Bahrain, which is important for the Saudi Arabia relationship. And at the same time, Hungary, meanwhile in the European Union, decided to block the European Union's freezing of Russian assets that they want to send over to Ukraine. Right. So now we move over to the other escalation, which is the Russia-Ukraine situation. Europe right now said that they are preparing for a full-blown war with Russia. And the Prime Minister of Hungary was the one that revealed that. Now, remember, Turkey is a member of NATO. And NATO, the chief, he came out and made a statement that NATO weapons are now authorized to strike inside Russia. So there was no clarity before, but he was authorizing that NATO Russians can strike inside Russia. And at the same time, President Biden today gave Ukraine permission that they are now allowed to use US weapons to target and strike within Russia using US weapons that are sent across. That was the latest and the different news that was being reported. So Putin has now said that this is a direct escalation for the US and the ones that produce the weapons like UK in terms of escalating that situation. We need serious de-escalation because those different relationships will have impacts, as I covered last week, in the different areas across there. And so that's going to do it for all of the different updates on Bitcoin Hard Talk. Now, remember, this impacts Bitcoin because of the semiconductor chips through China, and the oil relationships and the cost of energy and the different relationships that we've covered in the Bitcoin mining industry, and also Bitcoin as a hedge against war, and then what will happen in the new world order when central bank digital currencies don't trust each other and Bitcoin can become much like gold was before. And so that's going to do everything. Right now, just before we close off, I just want to do a quick plug if you're enjoying this. While I cover the latest on everything that happens this week on Bitcoin Hard Talk, make sure you're a member of simondixon.com, the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. That's where I cover additional resources and send out a newsletter every time so that you can stay up to date. And it's also where I published a bunch of old videos. We're going to be releasing in the coming months where I take it where a little bit less freestyle like I do in this, but I really refine it down to very clear communications and create nice animations that really brings everything together in terms of what you need to know to build and protect your wealth. The last one I did was in 2020 after the halving. I did a video series called The Great Depression of the 2020s and how to build and protect your wealth. I'm going to be doing the updated one in the next couple of months. So head over to simondixon.com and make sure that you've got a membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, because that's where we do it. And I'm going to be sharing on simondixon.com everything you need to know for what I'm calling the Great Depression of the 2020s again, but updated for 2024. So that's my little plug. I know that you're going to really enjoy it. We're going to be spending some time on that. So always remember, no matter how bad it gets, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history in terms of being able to protect yourself. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to go really well. And I want you to be on the right side of the change. I want that to be done with peace, love, and unity, but our leaders are taking us in a different direction. So we need to stay on top of the information curve so that we can understand from each other that we are not the propaganda that our leaders are taking us down. So I will see you this time next week. Make sure you got a membership at simondixon.com, and I'll make sure you're on the right side of the change. Peace.